Welcome to the Foundation Series, your deep dive into startup compensation with industry leaders from across the startup world. Join me, Matt McFarlane, a people operations leader turned compensation specialist, as we uncover the strategies and practices driving success in tech startups around the world. Hear insights from heads of people, founders, and experts as we explore how to build robust compensation frameworks that not only fuel growth and retention, but do so in the dynamic startup environment that we all know and love. Let's get into it. If you think the gender pay gap is just about men and women being paid differently for the same role, think again. In this episode, we unpack what the pay gap really measures and why most companies misunderstand what it's telling them. Aubrey, it's so great to have you here on the Foundation Series. Thank you for joining me. You're obviously an incredibly prominent voice on LinkedIn for a range of different things. I know I have really thoroughly enjoyed, reading and engaging with your content. So it's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. I'd love for you to spend a minute introducing yourself for those who maybe aren't as deeply familiar with you as I am.
Hey, everyone. If you haven't heard my digital soapbox, LinkedIn is kind of where I store all my unsolicited opinions. I am Aubrey Blanche Serellano, and I'm the founder of a company called the MathPath. But what I really focus on is helping organizations build and scale equitable people and culture initiatives, as well as responsible AI. So think of me as someone who can kind of operationalize ethics within the context of business. But I'm so excited to be here because one of the things that I'm most proud of is the work that I've done around pay equity at Culture Amp. So I was a VP at Culture Amp most recently, where we were able last year to report the smallest gender pay gap of our peer tech companies. So I like to say we fucking won justice, which feels like the best win you could possibly ever have, which probably tells you a lot about me.
Absolutely. And couldn't be more relevant of a segue into the first topic, which is probably one of the most pertinent topics when it comes to ethics and companies and things like that, which is all around the gender pay gap. So, I mean, I'd love to get your take on just actually, firstly, clarifying what it is, because you and I have talked about this. I know I come up against it a lot. And to be fair, I've been confused about it in the past myself as well. So maybe it's got a little bit of a branding issue. But let's start by kind of setting the record straight. Tell me a bit about what actually is the gender pay gap.
Yeah, so I'll talk about what it is and what it isn't, because there's this really important misconception that I think pisses a lot of people off unnecessarily or gets them mad at the wrong things. So the gender pay gap is a really rough aggregated measure of the difference in average pay between employees by gender at a company. Now, what's really important to understand, this is what it's not, is it is not measuring the average pay by role. So what that means is that the gender pay gap is a measure that's really, really sensitive to differences in distribution among specialties, especially when those specialties have very different pay grades. So, for example, at the classic kind of tech company, you have many more men than women in engineering positions, which tend to be the higher paid. And so a company that absolutely pays each person by role fairly, but has a big imbalance in the representation of women in engineering, would still show a big pay gap. So I think it's a really useful measure, but it's important to understand what it does measure, which is that big picture difference in pay. It doesn't actually tell you what's happening on a role for role or pay equity basis. So pay gap and pay equity are slightly different but related concepts.
Yeah, really important, I think, to know what it's great for helping identify, but also like maybe what some of its shortcomings are, or what it's not really designed to achieve. Where do you think people most commonly kind of get it wrong when it comes to understanding it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people assume when they see a pay gap that it's related to like-for-like roles. So they say, oh, if there's a pay gap of 10%, that means that a female engineer is paid 10% less than a man. And that's not actually the mechanics of what's often happening. It's possible that it is, right? Like it can be that, but pay gap is rough enough that it conflates pay equity discrimination and things like imbalanced representation. And so for me, the most important thing that someone who really cares about this topic, when they see that data from a company, is why did you get that number? because the company, I believe, should be accountable for knowing where that number came from. And then also, what are you doing to address it? Um, the other thing I want to say is, WGEA, if folks don't know, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency really defines no pay gap as 5% or less in any direction. So recognizing that like 0 is this thing we'd love to shoot for, but it's not super practical to achieve just because of the realities of how companies are structured, and you're always going to have little imbalances. So that kind of within 5% is considered like exceptional.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, I guess, what's your take on sort of, total pay equality, like in terms of how achievable is it? Is it a realistic benchmark, or is it just one of sort of a number of things we need to keep our eyes on as a business?
So I think total pay equality, like I would like to say it's achievable because I really believe that everything in business is achievable. It's about your priorities. Um, but I think I care more about for like the average business leader talking about pay equity, which is that kind of fairness and like for like roles across each pieces of the compensation package. I think that that's a more actionable tactic. So like I would love a world in which someone who has more male coded skills doesn't automatically get paid more than someone that has more female coded skills, because that's the patriarchy. But talking about total pay equality would require us to talk about some like big structural issues that I don't think every leader is quite ready to talk about. Whereas I think it's, for the most part, most people don't think it's super controversial that like pay equity should be a thing that can be achieved. And that's really, really feasible for basically
Yeah.
any organization that's willing to put in the legwork.
Yeah, I love it. Well, let's switch things up and maybe talk about some of the ways in which, I mean, you mentioned that really impressive achievement and accomplishment at Culture Amp in terms of having the smallest gender pay gap amongst peers. Let's talk about it. Like, what do you think, in terms of having achieved something like that kind of result? What were some of the big things, the big drivers that led to that kind of outcome?
Yeah, so a lot of it is auditing. And I know that's not like the most exciting
Not super
answer.
sexy.
Like no one gets excited about audits except me and my team. But I think at the end of the day, Culture Amp, so we've kind of agreed that pay equity is a part of the value and part of the commitment we make to our employees, that we put a lot of effort into that. And so we have specific pay practices that help us achieve that. So things like we have 2 compensation review cycles per year. We do pay equity audits twice a year. So recognizing that because an organization's constantly changing, an audit that was done a year ago probably doesn't tell us a lot about the current state of comp. A part of that is we also don't do out of cycle comp adjustments. So we only do adjustments when they can be audited against peers. That's something that some companies don't choose to do, but for us, that helps us maintain that commitment to equity. We also look at and have settings around the total package. So as much as the WGEA looks at sort of REM outside of, we're a private company, so options, we do look to make sure that our stock component or our equity component is just as equitable as our base comp and bonus. And so anyway, I share that is the auditing is really, really important. But the secondary piece is we're really thoughtful about auditing things like our attrition rates and our engagement. Because what I've seen as a consultant with peers is that even companies that in one year had amazing pay equity numbers, something shifted in their workforce that meant that their gap got bigger. And it wasn't because their pay practices changed. It was because those folks left the business or came into the business. And so as an example of where this showed up, a couple of years ago, when we looked at our engagement data, we found that our high-performing female engineers were much more likely to leave. They were telling us, like, we're more likely to leave than our male peers. And so we kind of took a group of them, our business partner team sat down and just talked to them and said, what's going on? Like, not rocket science, just checking in. And the biggest driver was we really want more professional development. And so we were able to allocate for high performers in that department more professional development dollars that we saw close the gap between men and women in terms of their intent to leave. So that doesn't necessarily sound like a comp program in that we allocated L&D dollars to high performers who had high intent to leave, but because they were more likely to be women, we actually were able to close our gender pay gap by about 0.5 percentage point by retaining those women in high-paid senior roles.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it just goes to show that it doesn't always have to be about the money in terms of the sort of the traditional levers that you look at, right? Like, it's not just base salary. It's not these kind of like, is a man and a woman, or are a man and a woman doing the same job being paid the same? It's like, how are we essentially seeing in particular when it comes to the gender pay gap, how are we seeing more female representation at more senior levels where the salaries tend to be higher, and often the obstacles aren't going to be the same for men to get into those roles as they are for women. So how can we count for those sorts of things? And I love that it's more of a total rewards perspective than it is a pure compensation one, isn't it? So yeah, I love that. And you touched on a couple other things I'm curious about. So, you mentioned no out of cycle comp practices. Talk to me about what that means for things like, especially in a startup environment. We're talking like counter offers, we're talking about like negotiations. Like, how does all this sort of stuff show up in Culture Amp?
Yeah, so I will admit one of my favorite things about having worked at Culture Amp was like, this wasn't a policy I came up with. This is our head of total rewards who just cares about pay equity. And so she imagined this. But so one of the things we do is at Culture Amp, we really look at the people science. So the org psych, any data that we can get our hands on to inform our practices. So they're not just based on, well, this executive saw this thing this one time, or somebody has a vibe. That's our policy. And what we know is that in organizations where counter offers happen, attrition is still really high 6 to 12 months later. And so what we kind of came around to was, when we're balancing a low likelihood event, which is giving a counter offer to keep someone, is really low probability to spend a lot of money and to risk our commitment to pay equity. So for us, when we looked at the trade-off of we might lose someone who, even if we do it, we are very likely to lose anyway, it didn't make sense to trade off against pay equity. So, and I share it that way because I think it's really easy for those on the outside to see values decisions as just values-based. And in this case, it was actually, when looking at the data, it showed that our value around equity for employees was actually backed up by the data for a set of tactics that achieved that. So we believe that we're more likely to retain our employees by keeping our commitments to them, because we're not necessarily, just by where we are in the market, we're not likely to attract the person who's just after the highest salary. Like, the way we talk about it is like, we want the comp to be good enough that you're happy and comfortable and, it's fair. But if, maximizing your salary, for example, Culture Amp's probably not the company where you go for that. And so we believe that because we filter for that on the way in, this kind of values-based approach to compensation actually is the better retention tool for us than something like being able to throw an extra $15K at someone because Facebook came calling. And again, no judgment to businesses that run differently, but for us, we found that to be really successful.
Yeah, brilliant. There's so much to be said for being really clear about the kind of company you're trying to show up as, and like how you ensure you're consistent and kind of stay true to that. I mean, there's a tool or a model or framework or whatever called Even Over that I think actually a previous guest on this podcast had mentioned, where it was like, how do you kind of like prioritize these sorts of things in respect to your values? And I think, being able to say, well, actually, a pay equity for us is more important even over the ability to retain people. And, especially if you've got data there that proves that actually counter offers that aren't actually having the kind of impact that you want to. I think we all know that, and certainly have a sentiment or a gut feeling that counter offers only ever keep someone for a short period of time. But it's awesome that you've actually gone, well, let's go and look at the data and see what it's actually accomplished for us. And we can see that it hasn't had the impact, and it's really just a band-aid solution. So great to see that you kind of like stick to your guns and that's what shows up for people.
Yeah, and I guess I hope, a lot of companies look to Culture Amp for their people and culture practices because that's kind of our business. So I think we always feel a big responsibility to try to be as rigorous as possible. But my hope in sharing this is not necessarily that someone goes, yay, Culture Amp. My hope is that they go, oh, we could pull that off. right? That it's more of a like, it gives people permission to think a little bit differently or open their mind to a different way to solve this problem that is a bit closer to that kind of values and ethics-based approach. I think this is especially useful also. One of the pieces of data that we looked at was this idea of millennials and Gen Z are increasingly motivated by alignment of their values with their organizations. And so the kind of previous looking at just, oh, what's the value of the total package as at an analytical angle is just becoming less and less useful. It doesn't mean it's irrelevant, because there is like a critical threshold at which enough matters, especially in, we know, really tough economic times. That's very real. But that those kind of, it's not just about doing that, but also about sort of training your recruiters to actually explain your comp approach to a candidate. So when a candidate comes in with a number, you might be able to get a candidate, if your budget doesn't allow for that number, have an honest conversation about where your number came from. And I think you'd be surprised by how many times folks go, oh, actually, I see what I'm getting is different and that works for me. Or maybe it doesn't, but I think you have a better chance of getting them when you can speak openly about what the mechanics underneath the numbers are.
Yeah, it's so true. This is one of the things that I preach a lot to heads of people at startups, is like one of the big pressures I think on people teams and the head of people at the moment is that there is this growing expectation with the kind of increasing proportion of the workforce that is coming from Gen Z or younger, there is an expectation that you can speak to the number. You can kind of identify it first and foremost, but you can justify it too. Like, they're coming from a world where there is no taboo around salary. People are very open with it, and they're very comfortable criticizing it if it's not great, and praising it if it's done in a really great way. So I think increasingly companies need to recognize that not so much the number, but the ability to kind of articulate the number and speak around it is becoming such a critical skill and requirement for businesses, for sure. Amazing. So amazing episode so far. Thank you. I don't think for me to like close things out, you kind of like, I want to segue from like where you were talking about if people are looking to culture amp as a sort of leader in this and paving the way. What's sort of one tip you would give to people or companies that are really starting to seriously, and I would hope they'd always seriously consider the gender pay gap, but if they're going, hey, now's the time we really want to hone in on it, kind of where do they start?
Do an audit. I know I am a broken record, but I think at the end of the day, like, articulating that you want pay equity is really important, but you should never assume that you've achieved it without checking your work. And so there are pretty standard methodologies for calculating these things. I can go into the nitty-gritty if someone is ever interested about how we do it at Culture Amp, but that is it, is check your work. And that determines how you achieve pay equity. Because if you're already there, great. Tell your employees that this is our value and we've done it. Or this is our value, here's where we are, and here's the steps we're taking to go where we want to go. That builds incredible trust with employees that I think gives you the space to get there. But yeah, that's it. You've got to check your work.
Yeah, so true. It's a very meaningful thing, but it's also like an easily kind of analyzed thing, isn't it? So it's like, there's anyone with a spreadsheet can get it done. Amazing. Thank you so much for unpacking this issue with me. That's been really, really insightful.
Yeah.
Today we explored how the gender pay gap isn't just a numbers issue, it's a structural one. Audits, attrition trends, and professional development might do more to close the gap than you can think. Thanks for joining us on another edition of the Foundation Series. Make sure to head over to our website to subscribe to the Foundation Series for monthly editions featuring future interviews on startup compensation. In each edition, we'll explore the different strategies, trends, and challenges faced by startups around the world. If you have a burning topic you'd like me to cover or a standout guest that you want to hear from, drop me an email so I can dive deeper into the compensation topics that matter most to you. Join me next time as we continue to uncover the strategies and practices driving success in global tech startups around the world. Thanks for listening.